thought I knew everything about this case already. Mark Twitchell, the guy obsessed with Dexter who ended up killing someone because of it, I figured that was the whole story, and honestly, it didn't even occur to me to go back and reread the trial documents or his own writing again. Then I did anyway, and I realized I had the entire thing backwards. He wasn't a fan who lost himself in someone else's fiction. He was a director who used that fiction as a blueprint to finally direct something of his own. And once you start looking at every decision he made as a director's decision instead of a killer's, this case reads completely differently. Start with who he actually was before any of this happened. Mark Twitchell wasn't some isolated loner nursing a secret obsession. He was a working filmmaker with real output behind him. He'd already directed a full-length Star Wars fan film that landed a cameo from an actual actor out of the original trilogy. He ran his own production company. And by every outward account, he was a devoted husband and father. That matters, because everything that follows only makes sense once you understand that Twitchell had spent years building a persona of competence and control that wasn't fully real. He wanted to be seen as a serious director. He wasn't one yet. And somewhere in that gap between who he wanted to be and who he actually was, he decided to close it by directing something he could guarantee would get a reaction. Underneath that persona, his actual life was quietly falling apart. His first marriage had already ended in divorce a few years earlier. His second marriage was strained, and money was tight. None of his film projects had turned into the career he wanted them to be. He was the kind of person who put real craftsmanship into things nobody was paying him for. He'd once built a Transformers costume, detailed enough to win awards at local events. The sort of obsessive, technically skilled work that gets you admired at a convention and nowhere near an actual film budget. He was talented enough to be taken seriously in small rooms and invisible everywhere else. That contradiction, someone who clearly had craft but no real audience for it, is the pressure that was sitting underneath him the entire time he was writing House of Cards. What's worth actually thinking about here isn't the violence itself. Plenty of killers are violent. What's rarer and honestly more disturbing is a person whose entire sense of self is built around being watched, around producing something and having someone react to it, and who never gets that reaction at a scale that satisfies him. For most people in that position, the frustration just stays frustration. For Twitchell, it seems to have curdled into something closer to entitlement. The belief that he deserved an audience, and if the film industry wasn't going to give him one, he'd manufacture a moment dramatic enough that people would finally have to pay attention. That's a very different psychological profile than obsessive fan copies his favorite show. It's closer to someone who had quietly decided his own mediocrity was an injustice and murder was the one project guaranteed to get reviewed. In September of 2008, he wrote and shot a short film called House of Cards. On the surface, it's a 7-minute horror short about a killer who lures men to a garage and murders them. Everyone who's covered this case treats that film as foreshadowing, a creepy coincidence or evidence he was planning it out loud. But watch what he actually did with it. He didn't just write a fictional kill scene. He built the entire physical set for it, rented this actual garage on the south side of Edmonton, staged the real props, ran a real crew through the blocking, and then, 17 days after wrapping that shoot, walked back onto that same set and performed the scene for real with a real person who had no idea he'd been cast. That's the piece almost nobody sits with. Twitchell didn't rehearse a murder in his head and then commit one. He rehearsed it on camera with actors, exactly the way a director blocks a scene before the real take, and then simply swapped in a genuine victim once he was satisfied with how it would look. His casting process is the next thing that should unsettle you. Twitchell built a fake female dating profile on Plenty of Fish, attractive photo, warm messages, the works, and used it to bring men to that garage under the belief they were meeting her for a date. Part of that setup included sending detailed directions to the garage, casual and joking in tone, even reassuring targets not to worry if the neighbors mistook them for a burglar. That's not just luring somebody to a location. That's a director giving blocking notes to someone who doesn't know he's in the scene. Johnny Altinger, 38, a quality control inspector who was excited about the woman he'd been messaging, was one of them. But he wasn't the first. Weeks earlier, a man named Gilles Tétrault answered the exact same profile, walked into the exact same garage, and fought his way out alive. He was so humiliated at having been catfished that he never told police. In film terms, Tetreault wasn't spared. He was a first take Twitchell wasn't happy with. Johnny was the take he printed. On the night of October 10th, Johnny Altinger walked into that garage expecting a date. Police believe Twitchell hit him with a lead pipe the moment he stepped through the door, then stabbed him to death on the concrete. What Twitchell did next is where this case stops looking like a crime of passion and starts looking like a man executing coverage for a scene he'd already storyboarded. He attempted to burn the body, then considered the river, then settled on a storm sewer, driving around the city for hours with the remains in his trunk. At one point, sitting at red lights next to strangers and thinking, in his own words, that none of them had any idea what he was sitting on. He was doing all of this behind the wheel of a car with the vanity plate DRK Jedi, a small, almost throwaway detail, except it's the same instinct running underneath everything else he did. Even his license plate was branding. Even in the middle of disposing of a body, he was still performing an identity for an audience that wasn't there. That detail alone tells you what he actually got out of that night. Not rage, not panic. A kind of directorial satisfaction in knowing he'd staged something the world around him couldn't see. Here's where the reframe really lands. Police found a document on Twitchell's deleted files called SK Confessions, 42 pages, written in the first person, describing the killing in granular detail. The document even described exactly how he'd prepared the space. Plastic sheeting hung on the walls, cleaning supplies laid out and ready before anyone had been hurt at all. And when police searched that garage, that's precisely what they found, matching the writing almost detail for detail. He claimed under oath it was just a screenplay idea. Investigators believed SK stood for serial killer and that what they were reading was a diary. Both of those readings missed the more disturbing option, which is that for Twitchell, there was no difference between the two. He wrote the murder the way he'd write any scene he was proud of. "I thrust it into his gut," he wrote. His reaction was pure Hollywood. Not a confession of guilt. A director's note on a performance he found convincing. A retired FBI profiler who later studied that document for a television investigation picked up on something even sharper than the film set language. She noticed that Twitchell didn't write about the murder like an act of violence at all. He wrote about it like a date. The care he put into staging the room, the outfit he chose. A weapon he described as simple, elegant, and beautiful. To most people, that reads like a killer with a flair for the dramatic. To her, it read like a man who had never been able to get real intimacy, real attention, or a real reaction out of anyone, and had finally figured out the one interaction where he could guarantee all three. The murder wasn't a performance of violence for Twitchell. It was the first time in his life he felt like the main character instead of a filmmaker nobody had taken seriously yet. The part of that analysis people gloss over is what it means that he could write like that with zero apparent guilt sitting underneath it. Most people, even people capable of terrible things, carry some emotional residue afterward. Shame, fear, dissociation, something. Twitchell's writing shows almost none of that. He evaluates his own murder the way a director watches dailies, looking for whether the take worked. That's not the profile of someone who lost control and did something monstrous in a moment of rage. It's the profile of someone who was never fully connected to what he was doing as a real human act in the first place. For him, Johnny Altinger's death registered less as a life he ended and more as a scene he'd successfully executed. That distinction is what actually makes this case frightening. It's not that he wanted to kill someone, it's that killing someone didn't feel meaningfully different to him than shooting a short film. Both were just projects he was finally getting right. And then the document just stops. It describes disposing of the remains in the sewer, and the pages end there. No wrap-up, no reflection, nothing. Everyone treats that as an unfinished confession. It's more useful to think of it as an unfinished script, because that's exactly the problem Twitchell ran into in real life too. He had written and rehearsed everything up to the kill. He had never written what happens after, how you actually get away with it, how you actually dispose of a body, how you actually explain a missing man to the people who love him. He improvised his way through Johnny's disappearance, sending fake emails from Johnny's own account about a sudden trip to Costa Rica, quitting Johnny's job for him by email, and it fell apart almost immediately because the people who actually knew Johnny noticed what a director working from a script never would. His passport was still sitting in his condo, and nobody leaves the country without it. That gap, meticulous when there were lines to read, sloppy the second real life required improvisation, is the through line of his entire arrest and trial, too. When police finally confronted him on Halloween morning of 2008 while he was getting ready for a costume party at his parents' house, an undercover officer lured him out with a fake investment meeting, and a tactical team took him down blocks from his own house. The detective who processed him afterwards said, bluntly, that the tough guy filmmaker was so frightened in that moment he wet himself. That's worth sitting on for a second. This was a man whose own writing described murder in language like elegant and beautiful, who cast himself as someone completely in control of life and death. And the instant he lost the ability to direct the scene, he wasn't a killer anymore. He was just a scared man in a parking lot. Once he was in the interrogation room, he barely spoke. Not out of composure. He had no more script. When he did finally testify, he didn't offer a confession or an explanation. He offered a rewrite. He claimed Johnny had somehow figured out the date wasn't real, flown into a rage, and attacked him first, forcing him to kill in self-defense. He actually asked, in his own words, why Johnny couldn't just storm off like he was supposed to, as if his victim had blown a line, gone off book, ruined a scene that was supposed to end a different way. A jury didn't buy it. In April of 2011, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life with no chance of parole for 25 years. Even the courts ended up wrestling with the exact question this whole case turns on. Was this one story or two? Prosecutors wanted the attempted murder charge over Tetreault and the first-degree murder charge over Johnny Hurd together, arguing both attacks were part of the same continuous effort to become a serial killer. One script, two scenes. The judge disagreed and ordered the charges split, ruling they weren't legally the same transaction. It's a strange kind of irony. A courtroom spent real time deciding whether Mark Twitchell's crimes counted as a single production or two separate incidents. And even the legal system landed on an answer that didn't fully agree with itself. Attempted murder handled separately from murder, two takes of the same idea that the law wouldn't let him edit into one film. Most killers who get caught eventually stop performing. Twitchell didn't. Years into his sentence, he began writing to the journalist who'd covered his trial, letters that stretched across years and eventually totaled hundreds of pages. In them, he was still working the same self-defense narrative, still insisting Johnny attacked him first, still positioning himself as the reluctant party in a story he'd actually authored from the very first scene. He wasn't confessing in those letters, he was doing post-production. Still trying, more than a decade later, to cut the version of the story where he's the killer and release the version where he's just a man who got unlucky. That persistence tells you something the murder itself doesn't. Genuine remorse tends to go quiet over time, or it turns inward. People who actually feel what they did stop needing to relitigate it publicly. Twitchell did the opposite. More than a decade in, stripped of every actual power he had, the one thing he still fought to control was the narrative. Not his freedom, not his family, the story. That's the clearest evidence that the director identity was never really a hobby he applied to a crime. It was the closest thing he had to a personality underneath everything else, and prison didn't take it away from him. It just left him directing an audience of one. That's the real difference between Mark Twitchell and the obsessed superfan version of him you've probably heard before. He didn't lose himself in someone else's fiction. He used someone else's fiction as a blueprint to finally direct something of his own, cast a man who trusted him, blocked a murder like a scene, and then, the moment reality refused to follow his script, spent the rest of his life trying to write himself a better ending. If you want more cases where you think you already know the story and then find out you didn't, subscribe. That's the whole point of this channel.